Hello and welcome to week 2 of American Government. This week we're going to take a look at how the Constitution came to be, take a little history lesson here, and also look at some key features of the document. Well, so far what we've done is we've looked at some kind of basic theory and philosophy underpinning government and why we have it and what it can look like in different forms. Now we're going to start our study of what we actually have in terms of government in the United States of America today. Before we start talking about all the nuts and bolts of how it's put together, though, we're going to go back and take a look at how it came to be. If we do that and kind of understand the forces that were shaping the Constitution back in 1789, I think we'll have kind of a better understanding of why we ended up with what we ended up with, and so I think that'll be more meaningful to us in the end. You'll probably remember that in 1492, Christopher Columbus came over and discovered the Americas. After that time, the European powers, once they figured out what he had discovered, started sending over expeditions trying to carve up the newfound land. No one minded that the Indians were living there. They were claiming it for themselves. They wanted that land for various and different reasons. Some peoples actually started moving to the Americas to live here. There were various reasons for that. One was that Europe was running out of land. Of course, they're not making any more land today, so there was only as much as they had, and their population was growing, and there just wasn't enough land to go around. Most people in that day and age were farmers, and there just wasn't enough. And the way that the system worked back in many countries back in those days was that the oldest child would inherit all of the land, and so then had a lot of younger siblings because they had big families who had nothing to do. So that could be kind of problematic, and so it was just really hard. Most people were farmers, and it was harder and harder to make a living farming. And so the promise of this huge new continent full of land was very tempting to a lot of people. Also, the governments were happy to send people over to the Americas and get them out of their way, because when economic times are hard and people are unemployed or otherwise poor, they tend to be unhappy people. And when you have a bunch of unhappy, unemployed, hungry, sometimes people milling around, sometimes that becomes a problem for the government, and there may be unrest and riots and things like that. And so in order to avoid that, the governments in Europe were happy to find some outlet to send a bunch of angry young men with nothing better to do over to the Americas to kind of get them out of the way to prevent something like that from happening. There also were companies who came over to the Americas, and we'll be looking at the British example in most detail. But there were different companies who would apply for a royal charter from the government in England to come over and do a particular thing. And there was actually some big money interests that got involved, because there were things that the Indians did, like grow tobacco, that became fairly popular in Europe, and that became a big money-making crop. There were other folks that had dreams of discovering gold in North America, just like the Spanish had discovered in South America, which had led to a massive amount of wealth for the country of Spain. Of course, that never really happened in the colonial era in North America, but there were a lot of people that thought that that would be found, and so they were happy to come over here and prospect. And so there was some investment, just like today when there's a venture capitalism going on. Somebody has an idea for a company, will start selling shares, and that sort of thing was going on back then. There were colonies that were developed as a profit-making enterprise in North America. Also, we know from the stories of the Pilgrims and other things that's probably been ingrained in us from childhood, but there were religious minorities that moved over to the Americas to escape persecution. And we'll look at this issue more later, but in the countries of Europe, there were established churches, which mean the government approved a particular church. And if you weren't a member of the approved church, then you were an outsider. And maybe that meant you were just frowned upon. Maybe it meant you couldn't get a government job, or it might mean that your life was pretty miserable because you were persecuted in various and different ways. And so there were a lot of people who wanted to escape that. And one way of escaping it was to move across the ocean. And so they came over, formed colonies to do that. We know about the Pilgrims, who were religious minorities, ended up in New England. There were also Catholics that founded Maryland, and that's how that colony was founded. The Quakers ended up in Pennsylvania, and all kinds of different religious groups came over to the Americas to escape persecution. And once again, governments were happy to ship their troublemakers across the Atlantic, get them out of the way, because if they were across the ocean, that was a lot better than having them underfoot, where they might cause more trouble for the government. And so the people, a lot of them were happy to go. The governments were happy to send them. I think it's worth just kind of taking a moment from a human perspective to think about what this kind of move meant. Today we might, take a new job in California and move out there, but we're, no more than a couple hours away plane ride from anywhere in the country. And we can, hop on a plane and end up in Europe tomorrow if we wanted to. Certainly that was not the case here. A lot of these people who left probably planned on never seeing their families or their home ever again. It was truly remarkable, I think, that they were willing to do this. But many different people, for all these different reasons, maybe a profit motive, or just trying to make a better life for their family, or maybe to serve God in the way that they chose, many of them decided to do this. And so that's how we ended up with European folks living in North America, were these various different motivations. Well, let's take a look at a map of the British colonies in North America. This map probably looks pretty recognizable if you're familiar with maps of the United States, because we have the modern-day state boundaries superimposed on this. But at the time, in the 1700s, what we had was a string of colonies from Georgia in the south up through Massachusetts and New Hampshire in the north, and Maine at that time was part of Massachusetts. But these were the 13 colonies, which became the first 13 United States of America. North America during the 1700s was split among different European powers. You can see over in southwest Missouri on the map it says Spain, and at the time Spain owned what's now Florida and the Panhandle and along there, as well as Louisiana Territory, which would become to be known during the Louisiana Purchase, the current states of Missouri and Iowa and Kansas and Arkansas and all that area there was actually purchased by the United States from France, but at the time it was owned by Spain. And so you had Spain out in the west and down south. Up in the north, we had, it says province of Quebec there, right on top of what's now Michigan and Lake Michigan. We had the French who were competing for territory as well. And then kind of sandwiched in the middle here, we have the 13 British colonies, and the land west of them says Indian Reserve. That was claimed by the British, and lots of European powers claimed different parts of the world, but the British claimed that, had nominal control over it, but that's where the Indians lived. There were no settlers there at the time. And so this is kind of how the map looked. And then in the 1760s, there was a war between England and France, and England and France are friends right now and have been for 150 years or so. But for most of their history, they've hated each other's guts, and they fought several different wars with each other. And there was a war between England and France in the 1760s called the French and Indian War, and the province of Quebec was owned by France, and part of modern Canada was owned by the British. And then, of course, they also had the 13 colonies, and there was a war that we'll look at the ramifications of that in a little bit. But that had a major impact on the future of these 13 colonies. But to make a long story short, the French were kicked out, and so by 1775, when this map is dated, everything there that's basically in the pink and the red was owned by the British, and the dark red was the 13 original colonies. And so that's kind of how the world looked. And if you take an early American history class, you'll look at all these different colonies in some detail. And each one has its own story of how it was founded, why it was founded, who founded it, and all that. It's kind of interesting, but we won't burden you with that in this class. But just know that there were different motivations. We already looked at some of those. For instance, Massachusetts was formed by the Pilgrims, trying to get away from the Church of England and some religious persecution. Virginia was mainly folks trying to make a buck, and they're growing tobacco and things like that down there. Maryland was formed by people who wanted to be able to practice Catholicism, because that was not one of the chosen religions in England, and they felt oppressed. So they came over to Maryland to try to be Catholics in peace. And like we said, the Quakers were in Pennsylvania and these other things. But this is kind of how North America looked as we're leading up in the years prior to the American Revolution. All of these colonies that we just looked at that were founded in North America, that were British colonies, They were founded under the authority of the British government. They had a royal charter where the king signed off and said, yeah, you can go start a colony. And of course, all the colonists felt that they were all British citizens, which they were, and that the king was their legitimate ruler, which he was. And so when they got to America, they didn't come over with the idea of forming, let's go start a new country. They saw themselves as British, and they were just expanding the boundaries of the British Empire, basically, and they had the opportunity to kind of do what they wanted to do, but they still saw themselves very much as British. And they were forming these colonies with the consent of the British government for a particular purpose, and that was kind of how things got started with these different colonies. When the colonies actually grew in population beyond the people that originally came over on the first boat and started getting a population, the British government knew they had to have some kind of control over these citizens in these areas, and so the king ended up appointing royal governors for these different colonies who basically ran the colony in the name of the king. And of course, in those days it took weeks for a ship to get across the ocean to get from Europe to America. And not only could people not travel very fast, there was no way of communication either. There were no telegraph lines, for instance, no telephone, no radio, none of that. So the only way you could get a message across was by sending a letter via a ship. And so messages also took several weeks to cross the Atlantic. So the king, of course, couldn't manage the day-to-day affairs, and his government couldn't either. And so they ended up forming a local government headed up by a royal governor who ruled in the name of the king and kind of made things keep going in these various and different colonies. Of course, in Britain, there was a parliament, which had been going on for 1,000 years almost. So the colonists were used to having a voice in their government back home, and they wanted something like that in America as well. And so they ended up forming these elected assemblies in each colony, and it was kind of a way for the best and the brightest in these different colonies. They got elected to these assemblies, and they would go debate the issues of the day, talk about the problems that were going on, and they could do some things. They didn't have a whole lot of authority. They were subject to the royal governors, but the governors were happy to have that help and wanted to have the people buying in to the government. And so the governors tried to work with these assemblies, and that worked fairly well for a long time. But the Americans were kind of an odd sort from the British perspective. They became pretty fiercely independent, and they got used to taking care of themselves. Remember, this was the frontier that we're talking about, and there were hostile Indian attacks and things like that on the frontier from time to time. But life was really hard in these colonies, and help and home were a really long way away. And so the Americans got used to taking care of themselves. They had kind of a frontier spirit. They took care of their own problems. They looked out for each other. And they were independent, and they really took some pride in that, and that's part of the American character today too. That these folks really, took pride in taking care of their own issues that rose up without having a lot of external help, and so, and the British government was happy to let them do that for a long time, and kind of look out for each other and take care of their own local problems locally. This arrangement worked pretty well for decades. We started seeing trouble brewing in the 1750s and 60s, so they ended up setting things on a path that led to the colonies in America becoming very unhappy and eventually fighting for their independence. Well, I think it's really interesting to talk about how we went from having some loyal British citizens who were populating these 13 colonies to having a bunch of folks who were ready to take up arms and shoot at their own country's soldiers in order to earn their independence. And how we got there is a complex question, but some of it's answered by kind of looking at the thought processes and the character of the folks that were living in these 13 colonies at the time. One of these characteristics is that they had no elites in the same way that they did back home. In England and most of Europe, we had not only kings, but we had dukes and earls who had most of the wealth and power. And in those days, you didn't get wealth by becoming a successful businessman most of the time. You were born into it. And so you didn't, apply for a job as a duke and get hired. It didn't work that way. You were born into that family or you weren't. And most people, of course, weren't. And so most of the wealth was concentrated in this upper crust of people who passed on their huge wealth from father to son throughout the generations. And so they were born. The moment they entered the world, they were important and they were rich. And they were permanent elites that way. And if you were just a normal peon, you had no way of breaking into that upper crust. And well, so the society in Britain and most of Europe was stratified into these classes that were immobile, and you couldn't move from one to the other. Well, in the colonies, it wasn't like that, and pretty much everyone felt like they were in the same boat, and there were no dukes and earls over here. And so the colonists really felt in a fundamental way that they were equal to their neighbors, and their neighbors were equal to them. And so they were kind of all in this together. And so that was one thing that helped shape their character. And so because they didn't have these permanent elites running around, these dukes and earls, they kind of got to where they resented that a little bit. And they didn't like people telling them what to do, who thought they had a God-given right to do that, because they were used to being equal with all their fellow folks. So that was one thing. Another thing is, we already alluded to this, but they got used to being left alone to solve their own problems. Again, crossing the Atlantic took weeks. So even if they needed help from London, it wasn't coming very quickly. And so the colonists got used to taking care of their own problems. And after a while, they liked doing that, and they kind of resented the fact when outsiders told them how to solve their own problems. They liked to be able to do that on their own. And so by being left alone to do that for a long time, they got used to it, and they felt fairly independent in that way as well. Also, again, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but life was very hard in these colonies. It was the frontier, and so there was a lot of sickness and disease and death and hunger and all these other things. And they were all in this struggle together, and they really took pride in surviving and doing what it needed to do, turning this wilderness, as they saw it, into a home for themselves. And so they took a lot of pride in that, and that kind of gave them the confidence to be independent. And they were used to taking care of their own problems and providing for themselves without any external help or interference in that. Well, in the 1750s and 60s, we had a major conflict break out in North America, and this was really an outgrowth of a worldwide conflict between Britain and France. And Britain and France have been friends for the last 150 years or so, but for most of their history, they really hated each other, and they fought a lot of wars against each other. And during this period of time, France and England were fighting in Europe, and they fought in different places around the world, and that fight eventually came to North America. And you remember from the map that we looked at just recently, the French were occupying part of what is now Canada, and were kind of pushing into the west, and the British, of course, were along where the 13 original colonies were, and to the west of that. And so they ended up having a war that lasted for quite a few years. They each had their own Indian allies. There were some tribes who were allied with the French, some who were allied with the British, and that's why it's called the French and Indian War. But these two groups, they squared off, and at the time, most of the fighting was actually done in what was considered the frontier. It wasn't in the 13 colonies themselves, typically, but it was more out along the Great Lakes area, which at the time was considered the frontier and wilderness, and up in what's now Canada, and areas like that. So not a lot of actual fighting took place in the 13 colonies, but it was quite a struggle, and the colonists did pitch in. George Washington was there helping fight the French. And so this conflict dragged on for a while. To make a long story short, though, the French basically got kicked out of North America. The British won. And to this day, their legacy continues, because if you go up into Canada, everything that's official is both in English and in French, because in the province of Quebec, just about everybody speaks French, because that used to be France's part of North America. So their legacy continues to this day. But the British, by winning this war, took over Quebec and all of what's now Canada, and also gained complete control of what was west of the 13 colonies. And so up to the Mississippi River at least. And so the French got kicked out. The British were really proud of themselves, but they felt like they had defended their American colonies, and therefore the colony should help pay for it, because they made the point, and probably had some validity to it, that look, we were busy protecting you guys from the French. If we hadn't done that, they would have come and taken you over, and you'd been living in part of France, and so because we fought off the French, we defended you, and you should help foot the bill because it was a very expensive war. And so the British felt like that. The colonists weren't as convinced of that because, the way they saw most of the fighting took place quite a ways away from their homes, and along the coast there. So they were a little less convinced in that, but they might have bought into it, but for the fact they really wanted to go over across the Appalachian Mountains into this newly conquered land that had been contested with France and move in there. And this is where it was basically all Indian land at the time. Well, the British really didn't want that, and so that caused some more conflict. And so the American colonists felt like, okay, you're wanting us to pay for this war that you say you fought on our behalf, and we really didn't care that much. But, we might be okay with it if you'd let us go settle this land that you just conquered for us, but you won't let us do that. So what do we get out of this? They kind of felt like they were footing the bill for something that didn't really benefit them very much. And so that started to be a cause of concern. And it wasn't just money at play, it was also pride and some other things that we'll see here shortly. And so the British felt like the colonists and their colonists in America needed to help pay for the French and Indian War, so they started passing taxes on the American colonies. And I will tell you up front, I'm not going to test you on what year was the Stamp Act introduced, because I don't care particularly. But you do need to know, in general, kind of what the British government was trying to do here. And so these different laws were passed. For instance, in 1774, the Sugar Act put a hefty tax on sugar, which was an important commodity. And the colonists had to import all their sugar. They couldn't grow their own, and so they had to pay this tax on it, which made their lives a little bit more difficult. In 1765, the Stamp Act forced colonists to pay a tax basically on paper. And in those days, we didn't have Kindles or tablets or anything, so everything was on paper: newspapers, land deeds, official documents that you had to file with the government, things like that. You had to pay this tax, and you got a stamp on it proving that the tax had been paid. And so it was very aggravating, first of all, but it's also expensive. So it made their lives a little bit harder than they had been, and more irritating. In 1767, the Townshend Acts were passed, which were yet more taxes, mainly on common imported goods. And again, a lot of things, especially manufactured goods. There wasn't a lot of industry in the colonies yet, so they grew their own food and stuff a lot of the time. But anything that was manufactured, pots and pans, or guns, or you name it, most of that stuff was still shipped in from England. And so this placed taxes on things that they had to have. Again, made their lives a little bit harder. Then the colonists liked their tea, and they couldn't grow their own, of course. It's kind of a tropical crop. And so in 1773, the tea tax was added, which put a hefty price increase on tea. And so again, that served to tick them off and make their lives a little bit more miserable. Well, these taxes did a couple of things. One is that it was a financial burden. Life was pretty hard in the colonies for most folks, and so having to pay these taxes, just added to that burden. Life was already hard enough; it made it a little bit harder, a little bit harder to get by. And they weren't just trying to save up for their next iPhone. They were trying to have enough food to live, so they didn't go hungry. They were really worried about the basics in a lot of cases, and so all these little taxes added up and made life, kind of unbearable for some. So it was a financial burden. But it was more than that. We already looked at how independently minded these colonists were. Well, it really inflamed passions among them. It made them suspicious of their own government because, again, they were used to taking care of their own problems, not having any outside interference or help or anything else. And so here comes the government, after decades of letting them manage their own affairs, basically, and say, hey, we're the government, and we're going to start making you pay these taxes. Well, they'd never consented to that. No one had ever asked these colonists' opinion about that. Suddenly, these government types start showing up and wanting to take their money away. And so more than just the financial burden, it really hacked them off. It really went to their source of pride in their own independence and managing their own affairs. It really attacked all these things that they held dear in their values of taking care of themselves and having some kind of independence in that way. And so it really, not only was it a financial burden, it was more than that too. It really got them in an emotional, spiritual sort of way too. So a lot here going on that the British really aggravated the colonists a lot. And so the colonists were ticked off about the taxes, but it was, like you said, it was deeper than that. First of all, Parliament in faraway London was the one imposing the taxes on them. Of course, if you're familiar at all with how the British government is set up, they have elected representatives in Parliament, just like we have people in Congress in Washington in our country today. Well, they had the Parliament in London, and the Prime Minister was in charge of Parliament and ran the day-to-day affairs of the government, and the King was over that. But the important thing is that people didn't get to choose their king, but they did get to choose their representatives in Parliament, and they actually got to go vote in elections. And so the people who were in Parliament, if they imposed a tax, well, they had been sent there by the people they were taxing, and so at least the people had some say in that. And so if our colonists in America had been living back in England, they would have had someone to complain to, because they would have elected these guys that were imposing the taxes. Well, there were no representatives in Parliament representing the American colonies, and so there was no one in London with these colonists. They didn't really understand their problems and what they were facing, their viewpoints, or anything like that. There was no one to speak up for their interests. And so this body made up of people from England who had never been to America probably were the ones who were passing all these taxes on the American colonists. And so the colonists were pretty upset about that because they really had no representation. And so during the Revolutionary period, we had that old slogan you may have heard, no taxation without representation. Well, they were being taxed and they had no representation. There was no one looking out for their interests in the British government. They had no representatives in Parliament. So they didn't think that was particularly fair. Again, we had that little slogan that came on. And if the colonists, they realized that they had no way of protesting, a 10% tax on their tea. There was nothing they could do to resist a 90% tax either. And so they felt very vulnerable because there was this government over in Britain that was taxing them, and the colonists had no say in it. They had no way of protesting it really through official channels, and they felt really cut off from their own government. They were, getting all these taxes imposed on them, but they had no voice in the process. And they felt very vulnerable because they really felt like this faraway government didn't understand their concerns, didn't have any idea what life was like in America, and at the same time was busy doing things to make their lives harder, and there was nothing to stop them. There was just no way to do it because they could do whatever they wanted because the colonists didn't have any representation to stick up for them, and so they really felt like there was no limits on the power of the government over their lives. That made them feel very vulnerable. They had no voice in their government, and there were really no limits to the power of government in the way that they saw it. It also really fed into their fear of what they called corruption. Today we might call it special interests, where the idea is the government is looking out not for the best interests of everybody, but for the interests of a few, the people with money or the people who have good connections and that kind of thing. And so the colonists really felt like, what their own government was doing was they were looking out for the interests of the privileged few, but they were placing the burden on the common people. And so that really made them suspicious of the government and the fact that they had no way of, making their voices heard in Parliament, and that Parliament really had unlimited power, it seemed like, to run their lives and place all these burdens on them. That really just went all over them because, as we saw, they were really used to being independent, taking care of their own problems, and being fairly prideful. And so this really went to the core, really cut them to the quick about how this government had all this power over them, and there was nothing they could do about it. So there was a lot of psychology going on here, but certainly it made them feel very threatened by their own government, which is pretty unfortunate. And so what we start to see when the revolution is starting to get brewing here, we had a disconnect between how the colonists saw things and how the British government saw things. The British didn't think it was a big deal because all their people pay taxes. They imposed taxes all the time. They didn't really think too much about it. They thought it was pretty fair to make the colonists pay for a war that had ended up protecting the colonists. But the colonists saw all this as very provocative. They were having all these taxes imposed upon them. It was a very rude awakening to them because they'd really got used to managing their own affairs without much interference from London. And so, this has gone on for decades and decades. And then all of a sudden, one day, the British government shows up and says, "Hi, we're in charge, and you have to pay taxes to us." And it was a pretty rude awakening for them. And the British kind of was their own fault in a way, because they had pursued a policy they called salutary neglect toward the American colonies, which basically meant, if there was a major problem, they would come help with it, but they just let the colonies kind of run their own affairs. And they kind of liked it that way, because the British didn't want to mess with it. And so if the Americans could take care of their own problems, then, that was great for the British and great for the colonists. And so the British really encouraged this policy. And so it was really a shock when the government showed up again after several decades and said, we're in charge and we're going to be throwing our weight around. It was really, it came as a huge shock to the colonists and really got them upset quite a bit. And it also caused more trouble on the home front, because these policies on taxation ended up turning the people against the royal governors, who were the only real representatives of the British government that were actually in the American colonies. And the governors, of course, were supposed to carry out the will of the government back in London, and so they were in charge of collecting these taxes and carrying out these policies, which were very unpopular. And so the people started turning against their royal governors, and it caused all kinds of problems. And so the happy little system we saw working in the American colonies for decades and decades really started to kind of come apart at the seams. And it was really kind of a surprise, I think, to the British, because they really didn't understand what was going on here, and that was kind of their own fault. But the colonists saw what the British were doing with through very suspicious eyes, because the government that some of them had fled from to come over here in the first place suddenly shows up and starts trying to run their lives for them. It really had them upset in a fundamental way. And so if we examine the root causes of the American Revolution, it's really a complicated phenomenon without one good answer. If you studied this period of history in high school, or some, maybe even in college, they tend to gloss over it quite a bit and talk about, oh, the taxes were horrible. Well, lots of people have high taxes, but not everyone picks up a musket and tries to shoot someone because they're being forced to pay taxes, But anyway, that did play a role. And so we can look at the pragmatic causes, or practical causes of the American Revolution. And certainly these taxes played a role in forcing the colonists into this corner where they saw their only alternative was to revolt against their government, because these taxes really were a big burden on them, and they felt like they were in a fight for their own survival on a day-to-day basis, that life was hard in the colonies. And so these taxes made life even harder. And so there were some practical or pragmatic reasons for the American Revolution, and that goes back to those taxes. So that certainly did play a role. There are also ideological reasons, and we start to see the colonists buying into a different paradigm than their rulers had. Remember our discussion of that, the divine right paradigm and the social contract and all that. Well, King George, who was running Britain at the time, was a fan of the divine right paradigm. He thought, I'm the king and you should listen to me. God put me here, and this is the way it is. This is the way the universe is set up to work, is that I'm in charge and you listen to me and I'll do whatever I want. And so that was really his mindset. And so if people didn't like that, that ticked him off, because he was thinking, well, God put me here and you're supposed to listen to me, dang it. And so he was going to get upset if somebody didn't do what he wanted them to do. The colonists, on the other hand, especially the thinkers of the day, the educated folks in the colonies, they were pretty big fans of the social contract. And we already looked at the Declaration of Independence earlier, and we see those ideas laid out. They really thought that the government was there to serve them, not the other way around. And so they didn't appreciate it. When the government shows up and starts taking things away without asking, they didn't feel like they had consented to that. And so they were pretty unhappy with the way the British government was conducting itself. And so there was a big clash of ideas there. And the colonists were also influenced by other ideology as well. Adam Smith was a popular economist of the time, and he really felt like the government, or the economy, worked best when the government didn't mess with it too much and just kind of got out of the way and let market forces take over. And so the colonists were pretty happy about that, because that meant the government wasn't busy in there imposing taxes and doing other things that they didn't like, and just kind of live and let nature take its course. And so they really bought into that, whereas the British government felt like they had kind of a God-given right to control the economy in their own colonies. And so again, there's another clash of ideas there. And so we really see that the British government and the American colonists were on very different pages. They weren't singing from the same hymnal, as we say. They had very different ideas about how government should work, what it should be doing, and that came to a head here before the American Revolution. And we also saw, with the colonist mindset about how independently minded they were, how they're used to taking care of their own problems and all of that. They were deeply disturbed by the British government's apparently unlimited power over their lives, because they were so used to being these pioneer folk who took care of their own business, and suddenly the British show up and tells them what they're going to do and starts collecting these taxes and stuff. And it really felt to the colonists like the British had no limits to their power, and they really felt that the British government was tyrannical, that they were not ruling in the people's best interests, they were just exploiting the people. And so they really got upset by that. And so as things dragged on, the colonists kept getting more and more upset, and they started doing things to demonstrate that displeasure, such as the Boston Tea Party. And you probably remember this story from elementary school, I would imagine, of how the British or the American colonists, some of them were upset about this tax on tea and having to buy from only one company that was owned by the government and that sort of thing. And so to express their displeasure, they dressed up in costumes that made them look like Indians and went onto this ship in Boston Harbor and dumped its cargo of tea into the harbor. Well, the colonists had been really ticked off to this point, and the British government was kind of puzzled by their ticked offedness, to invent a phrase. But the British government, wasn't particularly angry, but the Boston Tea Party really made them angry and said, what in the world, these stupid colonists, they're British citizens, they're supposed to do what they're told. Everyone else has to pay taxes. Why can't they pay taxes? And what are they, they're acting like children here. It really got the British government terribly upset. And so now the colonists were upset, the British government was upset, and things just only went downhill from there. And the British Parliament said, well, we'll show them who's boss. And so in 1774, they passed what were called the Coercive Acts, and the colonists had a different name for them, the Intolerable Acts. And really, these were designed to punish the colonists in America for being disobedient to their government. And it was designed to kind of put them in their place. Well, this fed right back into what the colonists were unhappy about in the first place. They were unhappy about the government pushing them around, having unlimited power over their lives, and they didn't have a voice in it. And so here, this parliament that they didn't have a voice in across the ocean started punishing them like little kids for acting like little kids, I guess. So anyway, it just made the situation even worse. So at that point in time, the British government had the opportunity to kind of act like the grown-ups and say, oh, well, we're sorry about these concerns. What can we do to get you back on board and make you a little bit happier? But they didn't do that. They just had the attitude, well, we'll show you who's boss. And so that just didn't go well at all. And so the colonists kept getting more upset, and the government now was upset too, back in London. And so things just really started to deteriorate. Well, so we see the situation really deteriorating, and the colonists recognized that as well. And so they called a convention of representatives from most of the colonies to meet together and figure out a way to reach a compromise with the British government. It's important to remember we're so used to having a country made up of all these different states, which some of which used to be colonies. We just think of ourselves as one country. They did not think of themselves as one entity back in those days. All these different colonies, they were different colonies. There was no centralized structure among these 13 different colonies. The only thing they had in common was their allegiance to Britain. And so there was no body of colony, that made up of people from all these different colonies. And so this was something that had never been done before, to have representatives of all these colonies meet together and talk. But they were willing to do that, trying to figure out a way to ratchet things down a little bit before things got too much worse. And so in 1774, the First Continental Congress met to try to come up with some kind of way to reach a compromise with Britain, and that really didn't go anywhere. And then things really took a turn for the worse in 1775 when we had shots fired for the first time between colonists and British troops at Lexington. And this happened when the colonists were basically stockpiling weapons because they kind of saw where things were headed, and they were in fear of their own government. And so they started gathering up weapons, in case they needed to fight. And the British government was alarmed by this because they thought they were going to have a war on their hands with their own people. And so they went to seize all these weapons, and the colonists tried to keep them from seizing the weapons. And so there were some shots exchanged. And so that really got everyone's attention. So we had a Second Continental Congress convene in 1775, again, trying to reach some sort of compromise, just like the first Congress had. But by this point in 1775, many realized that the compromise really wasn't possible, that the British government was really intent on teaching the colonists a lesson, that they weren't going to back down and leave them with their honor and independence intact and everything. And so the colonists started to see, many of them, that independence from Britain really needed to be the goal, that they needed to be their own country and have no more ties to the king or London or any of that, and run their own affairs permanently. And so that was a real change in their mindset. But after all this bad blood between the British and their American colonists, suddenly they started to see themselves more as Americans rather than as British citizens. They saw that the way forward was to be their own country. So the Continental Congress ended up forming a committee, which famously included Thomas Jefferson, to draft a document that would lay out a rationale for self-government of the colonies. We already looked at part of that, and that was the Declaration of Independence. And it was basically a Dear John letter to the king in London saying, here are our ideas about government, and they're all based on the social contract, that the government's supposed to serve the people, and that if it doesn't do that anymore, that people have the right to form a different government. And so that's what the people decided to do. They said, okay, thank you very much, British government. It's been nice knowing you. We're done with you now, and we're going to form our own government that serves us in the way that we choose. And so, of course, the king and the British government weren't ready to accede to that. And so that's when we had the Revolutionary War start. It's when the British government came back in and tried to put the colonists back in line. So, as we've already mentioned, the Declaration of Independence embodied the ideas of Locke and the social contract. That was really the philosophical basis for the revolution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all of that. And the idea that government rules through the consent of the governed. And here the people definitely were not consenting to what the British were doing. So they saw the opportunity to start their own government and break away. And so that's what we saw in the Declaration of Independence was, this. It started over taxes, and it snowballed and became much more than that, and really became a huge clash of ideas between the British government and their subjects in the American colonies. And so if we were in an American history class, I would go into some detail about how the war was conducted. Suffice it to say, in government class, that a war happened, the American Revolution. It lasted a long time, actually. Into the 1780s, from 1776, so dragged on for quite some time. For the most of the time, it looked like the American colonies were going to lose the war, and they were on their heels. For a lot of that time, they were a bunch of farmers and, with muskets and whatever, and there were professional British troops in their red coats that came over and, knew how to be an army already. So it didn't look good there for a long time, but eventually the tide turned. And the Americans ended up winning. They couldn't have done it without the French, actually. They're old enemies of the British. The old saw that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the French. And the Americans, with some help from Ben Franklin, came over and decided to help the Americans. And so the French used their navy and sent some people to help our army. And eventually, it was an upset to end all upsets. To use a sports analogy, it'd be like Webb City football, defeats the New England Patriots or something. It was didn't look like it was ever going to happen, but it did. And the British were defeated militarily. At the same time, it's kind of a complicated process, but the British people kind of got tired of this war and just said, if they want to go, just let them go. And so they kind of got tired of fighting too. But the British were defeated militarily on the field of battle as well with French help. And so the bottom line is the colonies were now an independent country. And so they actually got to put into practice those ideas that they had been pushing through the Declaration of Independence. They were finally going to get the chance to try to put that social contract stuff into practice, and that had never been done in the world. But now the British, kind of went back to London licking their wounds, and here were the American colonists who weren't colonists anymore. They were just Americans. They were citizens in a new United States of America. And so then they had to set about coming up with some kind of government. And some of that had been done during the war, and more would be done after the end of the war. So next we'll look at the system that they came up with. Most people don't realize, I think, that the Constitution that we have today was not the first form of government that the United States of America actually had. Before that, we had something called the Articles of Confederation. Remember that the American colonies started out with no central government at all besides London. So all of them were ruled from London, but within the Americas, there was no headquarters for the American colonies. Each one was its own separate entity. So Georgia just took care of Georgia's problems, and Massachusetts took care of Massachusetts' problems, and nobody really talked to each other even. So they were just kind of living in their own little world here in their own colony, never really interacted with each other all that much. And so the Second Continental Congress, after they drafted the Declaration of Independence, realized that, we need to start coming up with some kind of centralized system because we have a war on our hands where the British are coming in. And we need to coordinate our efforts among our 13 different colonies because if the British can conquer us one at a time if we're not cooperating together. So they had to come up with some means of coordinating their efforts and having some kind of centralized government. And so they came up with a document called the Articles of Confederation. And we'll look at more about what that did in some detail. But the philosophy of the Articles, it was basically to pull all 13 separate colonies together while leaving them as separate entities. Misspelling in that last bullet point, sorry about that, not in titles, it's entities. So they were all their own different little governments. They were their own different entities, but they were all cooperating together, basically for the purpose of defeating the British. You might wonder, as a modern 21st century American, it seems really strange that they would have any qualms really about pulling together in a united way, but you have to remember, up to this point in their history, they really didn't have any precedent for working together. Again, they were just separate little colonies. They had been they'd been founded for very different reasons. The Virginians were just there to make money. The Marylanders were there because they were persecuted Catholics, and the Pilgrims were up in Massachusetts, and on and on. They really didn't have that much in common other than they started out being British. So they really didn't have any history of working together. And they kind of, frankly, had different cultures, and they kind of looked at each other with a little bit of suspicion because, the Yankees up north were very different from the Southerners in Georgia and the Carolinas. Different cultures, different economies, different everything. And so they really were very different places. And so it was kind of unusual for them to be banded together like this. And they really, in some ways, felt more like 13 separate little countries than they did one large country. Also, remember that the main reason for the revolution, they were angry about having a strong central government that was based in London telling them what to do. So here they were fighting a war against that strong central government. The last thing they wanted to do was give up their independence to another strong central government that they created. So there was really a lot of pushback against having some kind of strong entity in the middle, that was controlling all 13 colonies, even if it was homegrown. They really didn't want another strong central government. They were tired of that because the British government had really flexed its muscle, and so they were seen as tyrants, and so strong central governments had a bad reputation early in American history. The colonies really didn't want to repeat that experience. They didn't want to create a government of their own that was worse than what the British had had. So there really was some pushback against having a strong central government. So the Articles of Confederation, as we will see, was designed to be pretty weak, really. It was designed to hold these colonies together in order to fight the war, cooperate on a few things that they really needed to have one voice on. But other than that, all the 13 separate little colonies were kind of left to manage their own affairs. Let's look at some key features of the Articles of Confederation, the government that they formed. And it was very different from the government we have in the United States today. It was a Congress with only one house. Of course, now we have two, the House of Representatives and the Senate, but they only had one house. There was no really chief executive. There was kind of a president of the Congress assembled, I believe was his title. And so there was one person who was kind of the figurehead, but pretty much Congress held all the power. Congress ran everything. So there was really no president like we have today. Also, the delegates to that Congress, they weren't elected by the people, they were appointed by the state legislature. And so again, it was really kind of a more like, think about the United Nations, and that's kind of how it looked in a way. All these different colonies sent their representatives to the Congress to represent the state governments back home. It wasn't like the House of Representatives we have today, which they're elected by the people. So very different method there. Each state had one vote, so there were just 13 votes. That's how it worked, and each representative didn't really do what he wanted to do. It was just you reflect the will of what your state government tells you to do. So again, kind of like ambassadors at the UN, they vote like their government wants them to. The central government was only given the power to do certain things that the states couldn't do well on their own. Its power was very, very limited because, again, the states didn't want to give up their independence and their power. They were fighting for their independence. They didn't want to replace the strong central government of the British with another strong central government. So by and large, they wanted to manage their own affairs. The central government had no power to enforce its will on the states. And so really the states would just come together, form this private club, of their own volition, and they really didn't give that central government power to push them around because, for the reasons we've looked at earlier. So if the central government said to do something, the states, they were supposed to follow along, but really there was no mechanism to force them to if they didn't want to. So the central government was very, very weak. One thing that made it extra weak was it had no power to levy taxes. Our federal government today can tax you to death if it wants to, and that's how it raises money, and you can't get things done if you don't have money in the bank. But here, the central government under the Articles, it could not raise taxes, and so it didn't have money unless the states chose to give it money. Well, guess what a state would do if it was angry at the central government? It wouldn't pay it any money. And so there was, again, that really undercut the power of the national government because it couldn't raise money on its own, and without money, it really didn't have any power either. It was nearly impossible to fix the Articles. When they drew it up, they didn't have a real easy method for amending those Articles, and so it took basically unanimous consent of all the colonies. And if you've ever tried to get a room full of people to all agree on something, it's not the easiest thing. Someone will always be there arguing that the sun doesn't, in fact, rise in the east. It's really hard to get unanimous agreement on anything, and so it was very hard to amend the Articles. So they were problematic in various different ways. The states were very unwilling, for the reasons we've already looked at, to give up any of their sovereignty, that is, their ultimate governing authority, to a central government for the reasons we've looked at. And again, you could think of this arrangement as a lot like the UN, all these separate little countries, these 13 states, sending their representatives to this common body where the issues of the day could be discussed, and they would take votes, and each state would get a vote, and it didn't have really much power, and it lived off of handouts from its member states, and that's kind of like what the UN is doing today. So did not look at all like the federal government that we have in the United States today. It was very weak, didn't have much power at all. Perhaps because it was so weak, it shouldn't come as a surprise, but the Articles of Confederation really failed. Didn't really do a good job of forming the government that the United States needed. The Articles kept going through the period of the war, and went for a few years after the war, but problems really started to crop up. The inability to raise taxes really curtailed the power and authority of the national government. Again, it was at the mercy of the states to give it donations, basically, and the states usually found other better things to do with their money and then give it to the central government. And so it was really, it didn't have any teeth because it couldn't do anything. It didn't have a dependable budget. It had no ability to regulate commerce between the states, and so every state did its own thing. If Delaware wanted to put up a customs office at the border with Maryland and tax all the goods coming across the state line, it could. And so, if you're really able to do that, it really feels more like 13 little countries instead of 13 states within a country. And so the central government didn't have the power to do that, and that really was problematic because the different states could tax things coming from other states, and really, instead of having one economy, the United States had 13 little economies. And so that was a big issue. The lack of the chief executive meant there was no single decision maker. There was no one in charge. And so everything was kind of ruled by committee. If you ever worked on committees, you know that's not always a good idea. There needs to be, you know, one person who finally makes the final decision, and we really didn't have that. The central government was so weak it couldn't really speak with a unified voice, and you know that's a real problem. Not only at home but also abroad. If we're trying to work with other countries, you know they want to know who to talk to. You know, who speaks for your government. Well, our central government was so weak that you know it was really that became a problem in dealing with international relations and that sort of thing. And so again, the United States started to look more like 13 little countries than one united country. And after the war, the British were gone. All the little states, you know, went back to doing their own thing. And so it really did seem, because they all had different cultures and economies and all that other stuff, it really did seem more like 13 little countries than one unified United States. Well, all these problems really came to a head in a historical event called Shay's Rebellion. And its name is a lot more grandiose than the actual event, I suppose. What happened was all these veterans from the Revolution, they were promised pensions and benefits and other things for serving as soldiers to fight the British. And the states were pretty slow on fulfilling those promises, or sometimes were backtracking on them. And a group of people who were upset by this in Massachusetts came to protest against the government of Massachusetts. And so they all started camping out. And there was a man named Daniel Shays who was kind of the nominal leader of this. And they really started, it looked like it was going to be an armed revolt or something. They had their muskets and their pitchforks and everything, and they were ready to take it to the government there in Massachusetts. And the governor of Massachusetts was very alarmed by this. And, you know, he just had, you know, his little militia that he needed to call out, but he didn't know if he, you know, had the power to crush this rebellion that was rising up, you know, there by these angry farmers and veterans of the Revolution and all who were causing this trouble. And so he appealed for help to the national government, saying, "Please help me." Well, that really was an occasion for the national government to look really weak because they really couldn't do anything to help. And so here it's really exposed the weaknesses of the Articles government because they couldn't really deal with this armed revolt of a bunch of farmers who'd probably been drinking too much whiskey and stuff, you know. And if they couldn't do that, then, you know, what if the British came back? Because that was a real fear for a long time after the American Revolution. In fact, we fought another war with the British in 1812, not too many years later. And there was always that lingering fear for a long time that the British were going to come back and try to take their old colonies back over. And so it became obvious that something had to be done, because if our national government couldn't handle a bunch of drunken farmers with pitchforks, you know, how in the world could it handle the redcoats if they came back, you know, an organized foreign army if somebody invaded? And so that really was kind of a shock and a wake-up call that, you know, we may not like a central government that has a lot of power, but boy, it would be nice to have one once in a while, wouldn't it? Because otherwise, what we have now looks pretty useless. And so finally, everyone was ready to accept that there was a need for a stronger national government. And so it was accepted that something had to be done to fix the Articles of Confederation. So, in May of 1787, most of the colonies anyway, or states now, I should say, sent some delegates to meet in secret to come up with a fix for the Articles. And they were meeting in secret because they didn't want, you know, outside interference and popular opinion to really distract them. They wanted to just kind of put their heads together, the smartest, brightest people of the day, and figure out some system that would work better than the Articles. And so they just kind of met behind closed doors trying to figure this out. And as I said, their stated purpose was to fix the Articles. But once they started meeting, they quickly came to the decision that the Articles were really beyond help. They were too messed up to really be fixed. And so something needed to be done that was completely different from the Articles. It needed to be replaced, not just fixed. So the convention broke up into committees to develop different ideas on what would be done. And by the way, by this time we know through history this is a constitutional convention because it ended up drawing up the United States Constitution. But they didn't just start making, you know, one idea. They started came up with different ideas, and then they met back together to kind of discuss what these different ideas were and try to figure out the best from each. They ended up with two major ideas. One called the New Jersey Plan that was favored by small states. And by small, I'm talking about the number of people who live there, not the geographical size. So we're not talking about acres, we're talking about population. But the New Jersey Plan was favored by small states, and we'll look at its features, and I think you'll understand why. The Virginia Plan, which in Virginia had a big population, that plan was favored by the big states, the ones that had a lot of people living in them. So two major ideas came out right away, and then there was some discussion had about which one was better or how to merge the two, and that was a lot of what was going on at the Constitutional Convention. Let's look at the Virginia Plan first and kind of look at its key features. For one thing, instead of just having one Congress, it really had three branches of government, which we've come to become comfortable with today, but that was fairly innovative at the time, and we saw when we looked at the philosophy of government and all why you'd want to do that, to kind of break the power up into different branches, and so it's not too concentrated in one place. Each branch would have some power over the others, so no one part of the government could get too powerful and kind of run the whole show. Congress would have two chambers. Both were based upon population, though. The number of seats each state would have in both chambers would be based upon that state's population. So the larger the population of the state, the more seats it would have in Congress. So guess what? This plan was really popular with the large states because it would give them the most power in the new national government. A chief executive would be selected by Congress. And so we'd have someone in charge, but Congress would pick them. That would thus give the large states the biggest voice in who got to run the country because they'd have more representatives in Congress, so they would have a bigger voice in selecting who would be the chief executive. Judges would also be appointed by the legislature, so again, the large states would have more of a voice in selecting who the judges were than anyone else. National laws would override state laws, so that was something that was fairly radical at the time because the states were really used to doing their own thing. But if the National Congress here passed a law, it would override a state law if there was a conflict between the two. So that was a key concession where the different states were used to acting on their own, but after Shay's rebellion, everyone was more willing to accept the necessity of that. Also, addressing a key flaw with the Articles, the national government would have the power to collect taxes and regulate commerce between the states. And so it was designed to be a lot more hardy government than the central government under the Articles would have been because it actually support itself by collecting taxes, wouldn't be dependent on the whims of the states. In contrast, the New Jersey Plan was favored by the small states. It had a national Congress with just one house. It didn't have any type of chief executive. No one person would be in charge. Instead, the legislature would appoint an executive council. And again, lots of people at the time, they were still wary of having one person who was in charge. It would look like King George, and they didn't like that arrangement, and so they were kind of leery of putting too much power in the hands of one individual. Just like in the Articles of Congress, each state would still have one vote, and so that would give small states and large states an equal amount of power. And so the small states really liked that because, a small state like, say, Delaware would have just as much say in Congress as a large state like Virginia, which had much higher population. And so really that gave the power of small states to punch above their weight. They could really have more say over the course of the government than their population would lead you to believe that they would. And so the small states really liked that idea. Of course, the big states did not, for the reason that they wouldn't have as much power. And judges would be chosen by the Executive Council. Again, national laws would override state laws, and just about everyone by this point realized that that was going to be a necessity if we're going to be one country, and that we had to have one central government that could kind of keep everyone in line rather than having 13 separate little countries. Looking at the different plans, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, they're really very different in kind of fundamentally opposed to each other in a way, because the New Jersey plan, each state has an equal voice, and the Virginia plan, the voice is greater for the states with more population. How in the world do you reconcile that? Well, some kind of compromise had to be reached, and for a while it looked like it might not be possible. They were really dug in their trenches there about trying to figure out, arguing one was better than the other and what was more fair and all of that. But finally, they did reach a compromise. And again, the key sticking point was how to apportion representatives in Congress. Was each state going to get an equal vote, or was it going to depend on how many people lived in that state? Well, of course, the large states, they wanted to base it on population, so they would have more power. The small states wanted every state to get an equal vote in the Congress. Well, how do you kind of come together on that? Well, a man named Roger Sherman, who was from Connecticut, came up with an idea that's called the Great Compromise. And this really saved the Constitutional Convention, allowed it to move forward. And it's fairly simple. We have two houses of Congress. We have the lower House of Representatives, which is based, in fact, on population. So the larger states have more seats in the House of Representatives than the smaller population states do. But we also have an upper house, the Senate, where every state gets 2 votes. And so each state gets 2 senators, and no matter how large or small the state is. And then in the House of Representatives, the larger states get more votes there. And so that seemed fair to everybody. And no one was completely happy, but it was certainly a way to move forward and kind of made the best of both. And so the Great Compromise was really important because it allowed the convention to proceed, and because no one was sure if it was going to get past that key sticking point there for a while. Well, that compromise kind of created a new problem because, okay, if we're going to base even part of the Congress on the population of a state, how do we count that population? Well, that's why we have a census every 10 years, is to count the population of the different states, figure out where people live, and that's how we determine how to split up how many seats are in the House of Representatives. Well, back in this day and age, it was more complicated because we had free people and we also had slaves. And since the power that a state would have in the new Congress was closely tied to how its population was counted, there was a big debate over how we're going to count the slaves. Well, the southern states where the slaves actually lived, interestingly enough, they wanted the slaves to be counted as one person. And it's kind of ironic because the states counted them as property for every other purpose. But since their power, their political power in the new government was at stake, they wanted to count the slaves as a person. So each state would be a person, just like every white person was a person. And that's what the southern states wanted to do. So again, it's irony to the extreme because they didn't consider the slaves as people for any other purpose. But for the purpose of counting them to give them power in Congress, they wanted the slaves to be a person. Well, the northern states didn't buy into that because they looked and said, you're not counting them as people for any other purpose, so a slave shouldn't be a person. You just need to count the white people, the free people who are in your state, and that's how we're going to determine that. Well, the slaves were a huge fraction of the southern states' population, so if they couldn't count their slaves as population, they were going to have a lot less power in the new government, so they were very unhappy about that. But the northern states didn't want to give the southern states too much power either, and so that was another key sticking point. Finally, we had a solution that was reached, known as the 3/5 compromise. And that is that we will in fact count the slaves, but they don't equal one person. Instead, each slave will equal 3/5 or 60% of a person. So if we count up 5 slaves, that's like having 3 free white people, basically. So we'll count them, but we won't count them as a whole person. So again, a pretty artificial thing, and to our modern sensibilities, it just sounds horrible. But at the time, it seemed like a pretty logical way to handle it. We won't count them as a whole person, but we'll count them as part of a person. And so the southern states got to have some more political clout that way. The northern states were okay with that because it didn't give the southern states too much power. And so, again, the convention could continue on and deal with other issues. As the convention moved along, we had continued to have more compromises come into play. One contentious issue at the convention was how much power Congress would have to regulate interstate commerce. And they already knew that that was a necessary power of the national government. From their experience under the Articles, they knew that there had to be somebody in charge to keep the different little states from raising barriers to Congress between the states, that somehow somebody needed to step in at the federal, national level and regulate that. The question was how much power Congress would have and how they could exercise that. This was an issue because of the southern states. They were very, very paranoid that the northern Yankees were going to use the power to regulate interstate commerce to outlaw slavery, and that would destroy the southern economy and way of life. And before the Civil War, the South was very, very paranoid about anything that threatened slavery because it was really the foundation of their economy, and also they saw it as part of their culture. And so There really wasn't that much industry in the South, much manufacturing and that sort of thing. It was really agriculture based. That was how wealth was attained in the South, was by how big your plantation was. There wasn't mechanized agriculture. There were no tractors and combines and that kind of thing. Everything was done with slave labor, and so it was really critical to the Southern economy. And so that's why they were very, very protective of slavery, because I think probably in their hearts they knew there was something immoral about that. And suddenly, certainly there were in the North, there were people who were advocating abolition of slavery even back then. So this would continue to be a big problem. Of course, would eventually culminate in the Civil War. But even back then, the Southern states were very paranoid and protective of slavery as an institution. And so they wanted Congress to have a 2/3 vote before they could regulate interstate commerce. And what they thought that would assure is that the population in the South was lower than that in the North. And what they didn't want to have happen was the northern states gain a majority of votes in Congress and use that power to outlaw slavery. And so this 2/3 vote, they thought would protect them from that, because they thought they would always have more than 1/3 of the votes in Congress, and so they could block anything that would threaten slavery. And so that's what the southern states wanted. And the northern states didn't think that was a good idea, that the 2/3 requirement would really tie the hands of Congress. And if you've ever tried to get a large room full of people, 2/3 of them to agree on something, that's not an easy task. And so when we require 2/3 votes, that makes it very, very difficult in order to get anything done. And so the northern states really felt that this would hamstring Congress to the point that they couldn't really do the job that they needed it to do. And so this became a contentious issue. And so there was another compromise called the Commerce Compromise, or sometimes the Sectional Compromise, between the northern delegates and the southern delegates, and this was worked out. What the compromise really said was that Congress could pass laws on commerce with just a simple majority, that 50% plus one, and that would be okay. And so the South didn't get what it wanted on that score. But the North, in return, agreed to write into the new Constitution an explicit guarantee of slavery. And if you look in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the Constitution, it says that Congress cannot stop the importation of slaves into the United States from overseas until the year 1808. And so there, for a while after the Constitution came into effect, more slaves could be brought over, chiefly from Africa. Even. And so after 1808, then Congress could stop that. And so any slaves that were in America, were born here probably, but up until that point, this was a guarantee of slavery. And so that kind of gave the South something that it wanted to help bolster the institution of slavery. And in return, Congress could still pass laws governing commerce with just a simple majority vote. So that was the Commerce Compromise. There was another thorny problem that the Constitutional Convention had to deal with, and that was how to elect the president. They really hadn't had a powerful chief executive under the Articles. Everything was done through Congress. So this was kind of a new job, and they had to figure out, how do we choose this person? There were several possibilities that kind of were obvious. One is they could have Congress choose the president. That was kind of like what happened in the Articles. There were problems with that, though. For one thing, the president would feel beholden to the Congress who had elected him. So once that president, gets elected by Congress, he would kind of feel like he's under their thumb a little bit. And we didn't want that, because the different branches, the three branches of government, were supposed to be equal. And the executive branch, which was the president, was supposed to be on an equal plane with the legislative branch, which was the Congress. And so we didn't want one to feel beholden to the other. So they really didn't like that idea too much. Another idea was to have the state legislatures vote on who the president would be. And that, though, would also have problems. For one thing, states would not want a powerful president. Remember, we're talking, we just had the Articles experience to where the states really hesitate to give up any power at all. And so we're just kind of really stretching things a little bit by having a powerful national government at all. And the states really wanted to preserve as much of their independence as they could. And so undoubtedly, they would want someone in the presidency who was weak and that they could control. And so that would really water down the power of the national government. And so that probably wouldn't work out real well either. A third possibility, and probably the most obvious to us, is, well, let's just have the people of the country elect the president directly. That also had problems with it, too. And so That really didn't look good either. One thing is that the population was largely uneducated. We're so used to every child being forced to go to school, whether they want to or not, we just kind of take that for granted. But that didn't really come in until the mid-1800s. And the Industrial Revolution played a role in that. And so back in these days, only the rich or the lucky children actually went to school. I don't know what the percentage was, but probably a minority of the population was able to read. And that was a real problem in a society where all your information about the news and the world affairs and all that stuff came through the newspaper. So largely the population was illiterate, hadn't probably had much, if any, school. And so the people who were drafting the Constitution, who were educated and were very smart, they really didn't like that idea of the uneducated masses trying to pick a president, because they didn't think they really had enough knowledge to do that. So that didn't seem attractive to them. And I think it's fair to say the Founding Fathers were, perhaps understandably, a little bit elitist about that, because they themselves were educated, they were very smart, so they really had a problem kind of giving this much power to the unwashed masses of the American people, many of whom had grown up in log cabins and things and, didn't know how to write their own name. So they didn't know that that was a good idea to leave such an important decision in the hands of people who might not have enough information to make a good decision about it. So this was a problem. Also, they had kind of a natural suspicion of popular opinion. They felt that popular opinion just is unstable and it changes kind of on a whim. It's unpredictable. And again, we want a stable government. We don't want a government that just changes its mind every 5 minutes. And so they felt like if we let popular opinion play too much of a role by letting the people elect this person, that might be trouble, that they might not make a good decision, because the people's minds, are changed fairly easily. And if you look at, opinion polls that we have today, you'll see sometimes we have a presidential election and there will be a poll on who do you support, and those numbers go up and down constantly. And so, public opinion does change a little bit, from day to day even. And so they really felt like that wasn't a good way to go forward, to base such an important decision on something as changeable and unreliable as popular opinion. And so the three main possibilities that they saw, none of them really looked all that good. So how do we elect the president? Well, they came up with a solution, and we still use this today, and it's called the Electoral College. They really went back to the Republican principles. And a Republican model is that you have the people involved, but the people elect representatives, and the representatives then make the decisions. And that's how Congress works. We elect Congress people, and they go to Washington, and they make the laws for us. We don't make the laws ourselves. We get a voice in who does, though. So it's a democratic system. But it's also a Republican system, because we are picking people to make that decision for us. And so that's what the Founding Fathers envisioned, was that the people would come up with representatives who would in fact elect the president. These representatives would be called electors, and all the electors together would be known as the Electoral College. The people would still vote, but they wouldn't actually vote for the president, him or herself. They would just choose the electors, and the electors would then meet and vote and select the president. Each state would then have a number of electors based upon its population, and would figure out its own method of selecting its electors. And you may be surprised to learn we still use this exact same system today. It operates differently than the Founding Fathers envisioned, and we will look at that more when we talk about elections in a couple weeks. But anyway, this is how it works today. The popular vote, doesn't really elect the president directly. It does play a huge role in it. But when we go vote, we're actually selecting a slate of electors, and the electors are the ones who cast their ballots for the president. And in today's world, the electors, we know who they're going to vote for before they actually do. Anyway, we'll get into that more later. But this is how they envisioned it, that the unwashed, uneducated masses of people would elect really smart people who would in turn choose the president. And as I said, this system is still used today. Operates quite a bit differently, but it is still in use today, and we will look in more detail about how it operates later on. So we have the final product when all is said and done. We have the Constitution. Some key features that they came up with, we have three branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. Each branch depended on the others. It couldn't run the government by itself, and they all needed to cooperate in order to get anything done. There are checks and balances. For any one branch, the other two branches are keeping an eye on it, making sure it doesn't get out of control. And so we have the three branches kind of watching over each other, making sure nobody does anything they shouldn't do. They built in representative republicanism. That is, that the masses of people in the United States, they would choose their representatives who would go to the Capitol and actually run the government. So we have democracy in play here, but they're choosing representatives to do the major work of making the government continue. We have a federal system. We'll look at that in some excruciating detail in the next chapter, which is also this week. But sovereignty was shared between the national government and the states. And so we really split the power between the national government, which is today in Washington, D.C., and the state governments. And each one had a lot of power and in some ways was supreme in its own area. But we split that power between the national level and the state level. We didn't concentrate that power on one level or the other. Again, we'll look at that in more detail in the next chapter. We also had reciprocity, which means that states had to respect each other's laws and citizens. In other words, the states had to stop acting like there were 13 little countries and come together into one country. And so there was no more, checking your passport when you're going between Maryland and Delaware, that kind of thing. And so we actually kind of took down some of those barriers, made sure that the states had to respect each other's laws, had to treat each other's citizens like they were citizens of the same country, and so kind of bring down some of those barriers and things. The Constitution created a stable system of government. It certainly lasted well over 200 years at this point, but it was open to change. And remember, that was one of the major problems of the Articles of Confederation. It was nearly impossible to alter them in any way to fix the problems that were pretty evident. Well, there is a built-in mechanism for amending the Constitution. It's not an easy thing to do. In fact, we've only had 27 amendments to the Constitution in 200 and some odd years. So it isn't really easy to do, but it is possible. And it has been done a number of times when there was a major change that became obvious that needed to be made. And so it was able to adapt to changing times a little bit. And so that's probably one of the reasons why it's been around for so long, because it was create a stable system, but it was also, we're able to fix it if we figured out something that needed to be fixed. And I don't think we can really overstate what an achievement the Constitution was. As Americans, we really need to be proud of that. It was a huge leap forward in human achievement. Up to that point, most of the world was still subjects to a king somewhere, had no rights, or at least rights that weren't respected. Around the world, this was something that was unique in human history. It's been called a 1,000-year leap. It really was an ingenious creation, really from scratch. There was some inspiration certainly from the British system where they had a parliament, elected representatives and that kind of thing. But no one had ever seen anything quite like this. There was no king here. There was a president. You had an elected Congress. You had three branches of government, which had never really been done like that before. All these ideas from the social contract and John Locke and all that stuff and Montesquieu and other philosophers, was put into practice for the first time. It was really something amazing that they actually pulled this off. So it was really something quite ingenious, something to be proud of, and that's how we ended up with the Constitution. Well, after they wrote the Constitution, that's really not the end of the story, because it still wasn't the law of the land. In order to get it to be adopted, there had to be a process called ratification. So, as the convention was winding up, really the future of the new Constitution was anything but certain. Some people thought it was a great idea, but not everyone did. The states would have to accept or ratify the new document, and for it to even go into effect at all, at least 9 of the 13 states had to ratify it, so their legislatures had to approve it. And remember, this convention had been meeting in secret, and so when it came out when it was over with, they came out and said, "Hey, look, guys, we drafted this thing called a Constitution." It was new to people. They're like, "What have you been working on? We thought you were amending the Articles of Confederation. We didn't know that you were drafting some brand new document." So, it was anything but certain that this would happen. So, in every state, there were conventions were held of delegates chosen by the people to consider the new document. And there were really two camps that developed. Some were for the Constitution, some weren't. The Federalists were the ones pushing for ratification. This federal system, and federal, again, we'll look at that in the next chapter, means that there was a national government, but there's also a state level of government, and those two levels shared the power. So the Federalists, they were pushing for ratification. They really thought that the Constitution was a great idea. And opposed to the Constitution were the Anti-Federalists. And so there was a pretty organized group of people who really didn't think the Constitution was a good idea at all. And so these two groups started debating about whether the new Constitution should be ratified or not. The Anti-Federalists had a couple of major objections. One was they felt that the representative democracy as envisioned by the Constitution would only work on a small scale. And if you look at human history up to this point, this kind of representative democracy that the Constitution envisioned had really only been tried like in Greek city-states and some fairly small places. And so here, for the time, the United States, even at just 13 states, was a huge country by European standards. And it was pretty diverse with people from different backgrounds and cultures and that sort of thing. They just didn't understand, was this actually going to work? Because you get a bunch of people, a huge amount of people, well, if you're electing a representative, who represents, 20,000 people, he can't know all of those people, and they were used to having representative democracy working on a much smaller scale. And so they just didn't know that it would work on a large scale. They were afraid that the representation wouldn't actually be representative of the people they were supposed to represent. So they didn't think that would work real well. They also were really concerned that the Constitution did not contain any guarantees of individual liberty. And so if you look at the Constitution without any of the amendments, there really isn't anything in there about telling the government that it can't nose around in its people's business. And they were very concerned because, here we are creating a brand new strong central government. We already had one of those, remember, with the British, and they became abusive. They were tyrannical. They abused that power and upset the American people by nosing around in their affairs and doing all kinds of horrible things. And so there's nothing in this new Constitution to prevent this new powerful government you're creating from doing exactly the same thing. And so they were very concerned about that. Well, as the debate continued, we had something important happen, which was the publication of what became known as the Federalist Papers that were published in New York. And New York became a really big battleground for ratification because it was the first really big state to take up the ratification question. And a lot of the smaller states were kind of looking to New York to see what it would do, because if New York wouldn't get on board, then really there was no chance that this was going to work. And so the debate in New York became vitally important. The Federalist Papers are still influential today for a couple of reasons. First of all, the convention, the Constitutional Convention, was held in secret. And so we really don't know what the thought process was that went into writing the Constitution the way that it was written. And so the Federalist Papers really explained by the people who wrote the Constitution what they were thinking. And so it's still influential today because, if we're trying to figure out what the Constitution means, we go to look and see what the people who wrote the Constitution were thinking when they wrote it. And so it's very important. Well, the Federalist Papers, they were written by, as I said, people who helped write the Constitution. They actually published under the name Publius, which is a Latin word meaning public man, and so they were basically anonymous. But they presented the arguments of the people who drafted the Constitution, why it was a good idea. Well, they addressed the two major complaints of the Anti-Federalists, and the one, talking about representative democracy not working on a large scale, they said that on the other hand, contrary to that, representative democracy was perfect for a large country because it would be hard for an elite to gain power. And you can kind of understand that, like if you're talking about something small like a city council, there might be a group of corrupt citizens that could band together and somehow seize control. If you're talking about a town of 500 people or something, it might be really easy for them to gain enough votes, by handing out bribes or something to gain control of that little government, and rule that town with an iron fist or something. Well, in a country as large as the United States, they argued that representative democracy is perfect for that because it would be so hard for any kind of corrupt group, to take control of a system that was actually this large. And so they said that, this is the perfect place to implement representative democracy, some large country like this. They thought it would work really well. Also, they said, address the second objection, which was that there was no explicit guarantee of the people's rights. Well, they argued that there was really not a need for that because the way that they set it up, the Constitution only allowed the federal government to do the things that were expressly given to it. And so, in other words, if we said the government can do something, it can do it. And if we didn't say it can do something, it can't. So there's no need to list all the things the government can't do because it can only do the things we gave it the power to do. And so there's really no need to list all the things it doesn't have the power to do. It's just logically, it doesn't make sense. And so since we didn't give the government the power to violate your God-given rights, we don't have to say that it can't, because since we didn't give it the power, then obviously it doesn't have the power to do that. And so they argued that really wasn't necessary. And you can see their viewpoint on that. But we ended up reaching a compromise. And on that last, that was really the major sticking point, the guarantee of individual rights, because probably the experience with the British had done a lot of mean things to their own people, and they really were afraid that the strong central government would do some of the nasty things the British had done. And so what they ended up doing was coming up with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights really was the first 10 amendments of the Constitution that expressly guaranteed these rights. And we'll look at those in a lot more detail later, but things like free speech, and you didn't have unreasonable searches and seizures, and no cruel and unusual punishment, and that kind of thing. And so basically, the Federalists caved on that and said, okay, fine, we don't think it's necessary, but we will list all the rights that you have that the government can't take away. And so along with ratifying the Constitution, at the same time, we'll ratify 10 amendments to that Constitution using the amendment process that was built in. And those first 10 amendments became the Bill of Rights, which we hold very dear today, that list all the things the government can't do to us, that our rights are protected. Okay, this popped up a little bit early, but also helped with ratification that George Washington would become the first president. Everyone kind of knew that's who would be elected. And they were really concerned that this president, that was a new position, very powerful. There was some fear that could be abused very easily. We don't want another King George. And so George Washington was a rock star of his day. He was immensely popular. He was universally respected. And so the idea that, okay, we trust George Washington with that kind of power. So that kind of helped people kind of say, okay, well, maybe it won't be so bad. If George Washington's willing to do it, and we know he's going to be good, they were willing to give him that sort of power. And so with those two things, that really kind of damped down the criticism of the Constitution by the Anti-Federalists. And so ratification could proceed. So the different states started ratifying the Constitution. The 9th state, which remember put that into effect, ratified in 1788. And so the new Constitution actually came into being. And eventually all 13 states ratified the Constitution. And so we did away with the Articles, and we have the new Constitution, and we'll spend most of the rest of the class figuring out the system it's set up and how that works today. And again, the Bill of Rights, as we already mentioned, that was passed at the same time. So not only did we have the Constitution itself, the Bill of Rights also came into being at the same time, guaranteeing everyone's individual rights and freedoms. Well, after the Constitution was ratified, there was a big test of it, which came up in 1800. There was a presidential election. George Washington served 2 terms in office and then was replaced by John Adams, who was the second president. Well, Adams served his first 4-year term and then ran for re-election. But he was opposed in that election by Thomas Jefferson. And as it turned out, Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams and won the presidential election. Well, there was some question on what would happen next, because if you look in world history, leaders rarely gave up power voluntarily. No king ever retired, or gave up the job voluntarily to somebody else. They were either died or were killed or thrown in prison or something else. And so the idea that a president like this, which was a kind of our answer to a king, would voluntarily, just say, okay, I lost, you won the election, and give up and go home. That was something that had really never been seen before, and so whether this would work or not was kind of anyone's guess. But to his credit, John Adams packed up and went home and let Jefferson move into the White House. And so the transition of power worked perfectly like it was supposed to. And so everyone involved respected the rule of law, respected the result of the election, and the system worked. And so that really proved to the world that the Constitution and the system it had created really had staying power. That we could, have contested elections, and everyone would live by the rules, and that things would go okay. And so that really kind of was the harbinger of things to come, because the government that the Constitution created, it's proved to be one of the most stable and frankly desirable systems of government that's ever been created. Different features of the Constitution have been copied around the world since then by countries that are trying to implement a democratic form of government. It's really been an inspiration to the whole world, and so it really was something remarkable, and it worked really well. And we'll spend most of the rest of the class examining exactly how it works, as we've already said, taking a little bit into some level of detail. But certainly, at this point, it's worth just kind of taking a step back and being proud of this achievement, because as Americans, we're all beneficiaries of what these folks did so long ago that was so weird and different at the time. It's proved to be something just really remarkable, and so we're certainly lucky to live in a country governed by a system like this. So with that said, that's the end of our story of how the Constitution came to be. Next up, we will cover federalism.